Welcome to NoLiesRadio.org. I'm Kevin Barrett. You're listening to The Kevin Barrett Show. I'm on here once a week, every week, bringing you guests who are willing to tell the hard truths and not just game the system like so many people out there. One of my favorite regular guests is Webster Tarpley, who's done seminal work on the Bush crime family with his unauthorized biography of George H.W. Bush, on 9/11 with his classic book, 9/11 Synthetic Terror Made in USA, and a number of other books. He's well known as a historian and economic analyst. In particular, he's been coming together with an anti-austerity coalition to fight back against this massive crackdown on the 99% that the 1% has been orchestrating with more and more intensity, I think, over the past couple of decades. And it's really getting out of control. And Webster is ranting and fulminating about it probably better than just about anyone. So his new book is a fascinating topic, just too weird. Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America, Polygamy, Theocracy, and Subversion. And now that Romney is getting within, quote-unquote, striking distance in the polls and being put ahead in the rigged polls, it looks like maybe they're going to try and put him in there to crack down on the middle class, to maybe start more wars. It kind of looks like a Bush-Cheney thing all over again. And here to tell us about the bizarre background of the Romney family and of this strange character who's riding out of the Mormon subculture straight towards the White House. Here's Webster Tarpley. Welcome, Webster. What's up?
Thank you very much, Kevin. I'll try not to rant too much. And there is this United Front. The United Front Against Austerity is going to meet in New York City on October 27th. And you can go to the Against Austerity UFAA webpage to find out all about that. And I hope we can come back and talk about that at the end. But my principal goal today is to tell people about this new book. As you say, it's called Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America with Polygamy, Theocracy, and Subversion. And people can buy this by going to progressivepress.com, progressivepress.com. You can also get it through my website, tarpley.net, if people are familiar with that. And I think you can get it on Amazon. But if you go directly to progressivepress.com, a meritorious publisher, has other distinguished authors like Kevin as well. Please go directly, because then the Amazon people, of course, take a big rake off on what they sell. So this is a book. It just came out. It's about 260 pages. I think it's pretty well documented. It's not exactly a scholarly work, but it's timely. And what it proposes is, you see, Romney is, of course, a liar. He's the Etch-a-Sketch candidate. He's the shapeshifter. He's this moving target. Nobody knows what he believes, except, of course, that in general he's a reactionary and a warmonger. That's obvious. But other than that, the details are very, very hard to pin down. So what I tried to do is to say, look, let's not pay too much attention to the words coming out of his mouth right now, but let's look at the tradition from which he emerges, and that is Mormonism, right? Starting a little bit before 1830 or so, in the area of Rochester, New York, Palmyra. It's the burned over area where they'd had so many religious revivals that they'd become cynical and indeed, I think, lost their moral compass. And,
well, just out of curiosity, Webster, what does the burned over area signify? What was burned over? Was it burned over by so many lightning strikes from the divine?
No, so many religious hucksters that had come through with revival camp meetings and then turned out to be essentially baseless. It really goes like this, and it's an interesting story. You have the Great Awakening in New England, right, centering in the Connecticut River Valley, which it's the border between New Hampshire and Vermont, and going down sort of through center-west Massachusetts. This was the land of Jonathan Edwards, a very, very evil figure. One of the prime figures of Calvinism, and his family then includes Aaron Burr, the arch traitor Aaron Burr, the enemy of Jefferson, but of course he was the father of Andrew Jackson. These are stories that lead us far afield. But the people who founded Mormonism came out of this area of the Great Awakening And if you remember Jonathan Edwards' infamous sermon, "Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God," that God is angry, hates humanity, wants to strike, wants to kill you. Watch out! It's a horrendous.
It's guys like him that drove me to convert to Islam.
Right. There's nothing compassionate or merciful about the God of Jonathan Edwards. So a lot of people had been through that, right? And that's in the 1740s, 1750s. It's actually also a British preacher, right? Some British preachers who play really a larger role than Jonathan Edwards. But then these same people then, with the American frontier moving west, they move into northern New York State, right? Upstate and western New York. So we're in the area now between Syracuse, Rochester, Buffalo, out here. And it's the area where the Erie Canal has just come through, right? It's just coming through. This is slightly north of that. But this is where it emerges, right? And here we have another round in the 1820s, in the teens and the 20s. We then have the Great Revival. So we have the Great Awakening and then the Great Revival. And the problem that you've seen, and you see this today with the Christian evangelicals, is that when you have gone through these born-again experiences several times, it does, I think, some damage to one's psyche, and people become cynical, and I think, the word I would say is antinomian. They begin to believe that there really is no moral law, that morality does not exist. And this is the leading feature of the family of Joseph Smith, the Mormon prophet, and his mother is a very, very hardline antinomian. This is what you see in Romney, by the way. I can connect this to...
No wonder Romney's hooking up with the neocons, because that's exactly what they believe from their own weird take on philosophy.
Yes,
Leo Strauss.
Exactly. The neocons are coming from Nietzsche and, Carl Schmitt, right, who believes the same thing. And then Leo Strauss is the Jewish version of Carl Schmitt. And Carl Schmitt, of course, was Hitler's lawyer. So a close friend of Hitler's lawyer, Leo Strauss, who gets money, as did Carl Schmitt, from the Rockefeller Foundation, he's the big guru for the neocons, and they believe, alles ist erlaubt, as Nietzsche says, right? You can do anything you want, everything is allowed. But in the case of the Mormons, it's this antinomianism. And the antinomianism is this: if they were Christian, which they're not, right? Mormonism is a whole separate religion. It's not Christianity, not Judaism, not Islam, and it's a separate country. But the antinomianism basically says, you're the Latter-day Saints. The saints are not bound by any laws, plus the end of the world is at hand, right? The Messiah will soon be here. And that has usually been used as a formula, be it in Christianity or Judaism, and perhaps in others, that means the moral law is suspended. Right? In other words, when the millennium comes,
that happened in Islam with Hassani Sabah and the so-called assassins, the Ismaili assassins of the Middle Ages. Same thing. If they throw
right, the thing that Bernard Lewis is so obsessed with, the Ismailis. Exactly. All right, so this is generally not a good thing, and that's built into Mormonism. In other words, it's essentially a religion that they don't proclaim it. Right? The neocons have proclaimed the necessity of lying and so forth. With the Mormons, it's not quite so open, but it's there. The Mormons have a whole series of things they call shelf doctrines. Right? This, in normal terms, this would be esoteric, exoteric. Right? The exoteric is what you tell the world. The esoteric is what goes on in your secret council.
Sounds like the neocons too. That's right out of Strauss.
Yes, except this is before, right? This antedates any of their stuff, and this it is the convergence, because what you've just identified is what a Romney administration would look like. Is neocons would be running the foreign policy, and then on the domestic side it would be Mormons, and you can see this through the presence of Mike Leavitt, the former governor of Utah, who has been made the transition director for Romney. He's a dyed-in-the-wool Mormon. He's a fifth generation Mormon himself. He is the transition director. He is likely to be the White House chief of staff, and he's filling the plum book with Mormons, with the members of the Latter-day Saints. In other words, quite a few people, Wayne Madsen, some others, have been warning about a wave of Mormon nepotism that has never been seen before, right? Beyond anything that any other administration has done. The other thing to add about Romney is that he is a close personal friend of Benjamin Netanyahu and has been since 1976 when they worked together in the same office. They both were employed by the Boston Consulting Group. So they have had a lifelong partnership, or a 4-decade or almost 4-decade partnership, where Bibi gives political advice to Mitt, and Mitt gives financial advice to Bibi. And if you go back to the Republican primaries, Romney has been very open to the fact that he, you may remember when Newt Gingrich said the Palestinians were culturally inferior and things like this, Romney said, well, you should watch out. You shouldn't say that unless you clear that with Netanyahu. Then later Romney said the same thing. So presumably Netanyahu approved that. But what he said is that he would make Netanyahu the arbiter of U.S. policy in the Middle East openly. Right? This maybe has been the case.
Oh boy!
For a while.
Well, everybody better quickly dig a fallout shelter then.
Yeah, it's dangerous. And again, there is this apocalyptic element, which I guess we should also point to. The Mormon idea is this notion that Joseph Smith introduced, right? That Christ came back to earth after the ascension, right? The ascension is it's in the New Testament, but what Joseph Smith adds to that is that Christ then comes back to earth, and this occurs in Jackson County, Missouri, most likely. It's somewhat controversial. Some say Central America or South America, but I think most of them would say Jackson County, Missouri, of all places, which is where they say the Garden of Eden was, right? And that Adam, was there, and that later when he was kicked out and had to go east of Eden, that's a little bit further east in Missouri. So that's where Christ will return. So the idea is that the saints, the Mormons, will gather. Some of them will be in Salt Lake City, but I guess at some point they're all going to move to Jackson County, Missouri. However, parallel to
Webster,
this,
let me just stop you for a second. That's kind of interesting and evocative in that this apocalyptic theology is pointing towards that part of Missouri, which really isn't very far from the New Madrid fault, where we're all waiting for a 9-point earthquake to level about half of the eastern half of the United States.
And this was, of course, not long after, right? And the Book of Mormon is, 10 or 20 years at the most after precisely that earthquake. But see, the idea is this. The Mormons also want the ingathering of the Jews to Palestine, and indeed when Joseph Smith sends his first leadership team, he sends the entire leadership of the Mormon Church to England, which I'd like to come back to that because I think that's the key to the whole thing. But he also sends a delegation to Palestine, and the guy in Palestine meets with the rabbis and others in Jerusalem, and it puts out a call that there should be now the return of the diaspora, and the Jews should gather in Jerusalem preparatory to the end of the world. So,
so the Mormons are like the original Zionists? Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, I guess you could say that. In other words, Zion, in Mormonism, Zion can mean, for example, Zion for them is Jackson County, Missouri. And when they, for example, if you're a Mormon stake president, right, like Romney was a Mormon stake president, what they mean by stake is a stake in the tent of Zion, right? The stake that you pound into the ground when you put up a tent. So you have the New Jerusalem or Zion; these are more or less interchangeable, and then you have the Jerusalem, and that's also Zion. So those are the two poles. Wow. Now, here's the thing: where do they
Webster,
get?
I just came up with a thought here. Why don't we solve the whole Middle East problem by moving Israel and all of the Mormons to the New Madrid fault zone, Missouri? And then when the earthquake comes, we'll be free and clear.
Well, I'm for a peaceful solution, and I don't want to see anybody swallowed up. This is not my goal. But here's the thing, to denounce what this is. The thesis of my book, some or most of what I've told you now is fairly well known. The thing that is unique about my book is this, that I make the case that the Mormons are a deployment of the British East India Company. In other words, that is their sponsor. They are sponsored by the principal engine of colonialism and imperialism in their time. The people who brought you Zionism, the British, Lord Palmerston. But in this case, it's a little bit older. It's the generation before Lord Palmerston. So, in particular, people should take a look at On Liberty by John Stuart Mill. Right? John Stuart Mill was he was a top official of the British East India Company. He was the intelligence director of the British East India Company. He worked in it all his life. This is the engine of genocide in India, right? They killed 20, 30, 40 million, 50 million people. Unbelievable stuff that they did. His education was supervised by Jeremy Bentham, who, to just briefly, is one of the greatest monsters of recent centuries. And I can't go into Jeremy Bentham because this just gets to be out of sight. But
it's actually ironic that the libertarians had considered John Stuart Mill a hero for his book on liberty, when in fact what he actually did during his lifetime with the East India Company was pretty far removed from any kind of libertarian ideal. Exactly.
He argued there was the great mutiny in India, right, at the end of the 1850s, in this time of Brigham Young by then. But John Stuart Mill was the top intelligence official of the British East India Company. And when the rest of the British oligarchy said, look, the rule of the British East India Company is so monstrous and so genocidal, this is embarrassing us, we're going to transfer India to the British Crown. In other words, India is not going to be the private property of this East India Company that's killing everybody. We're going to have British colonial administrators go in there. John Stuart Mill fought to the last to prevent that from happening. He said, no, India's private property. Don't politicize India. Leave it in private hands. Don't have the government come in. So this monster, he's another monster, John Stuart Mill, trained by Bentham. He had a nervous breakdown early in life. His father, James Mill, is another one of these characters in the British East India Company. And he writes the history of India, right? Very, very interesting. History of British India. So they're all involved in this India stuff. And take a look at On Liberty. If you look at On Liberty, there's a whole passage, quite long, I put it in my book, excerpted. John Stuart Mill defends Mormonism. By this point, the Mormons are out in Utah. They're in Salt Lake City. And there's a worldwide scandal about the fact that Brigham Young is a theocratic dictator, more absolute than the Tsar of Russia, right? Life and death power over everybody, because he's a theocrat. He's the prophet. He's God's, representative, not even vicar. He's practically God on earth. And the big question, that there's a whole genre of literary studies, the escape from Salt Lake City, because the idea is that women are being kidnapped and, conned into going to Salt Lake City, and then they want to get out, and the Mormons don't want to let them out. And there's a
famous Conan Doyle story, a Sherlock Holmes story on that.
Exactly, The Study in Scarlet. That's a little bit later, but that's exactly the same kind of genre. But, for example, you may be interested in Eliza Webb. Recently, there's been a movie on TV here called The 19th Wife, which is a kind of it's a modern story with historical flashbacks back to Brigham Young. It's on Lifetime.
These Mormons are so barbaric, Webster. I mean, don't they realize you're supposed to stop at 4 wives?
No. In the case
for my fellow Muslims.
I got it. But Brigham, Joseph Smith, the estimates, Joseph Smith is precisely an antinomian. In other words, he practices polygamy, but he denies it. He lies about it all his life. He goes to his death. He was killed by a mob, and this is deplorable. It's illegal and everything bad. But he was a polygamist for much of his life, and he denied it all the time. But he's somewhere between 35 wives is the low estimate, maybe 85 wives is the high estimate, and the scholarly consensus is somewhere in the 50s, right, the mid-50s for him. And then Brigham Young is similar. He's up in the 50 to 60, maybe 70 range. The difference is that with Joseph Smith, polygamy is practiced but denied, and it's only for the Mormon elite. Under Brigham Young says, I'm going to make polygamy, open, impudent, wild polygamy, the key organizing principle of the state of Deseret. I'm going to get every antinomian that I can from England, Scotland, and Wales, which is where most of them come from, get them into Utah. We're going to set up the empire of polygamy. And the idea is once you're polygamous, right, once you have a troop of 5 or 6 wives, you can't leave. In other words, you can't go anywhere in the world, really, and practice that. You can't go to Europe. You can't go to most places, right? Most places in the Western world. Anyway, you cannot go.
Well, it's such a terrifying specter, Webster. Just imagining having 50, 60, 70 wives. I mean, just one wife is terrifying enough.
Yeah, that's of course. There's a whole literature about that too. But I would urge you, in the case of Joseph Smith, I think he is a sex maniac. He says every time I see a pretty woman, I have to pray for grace. In the case of Brigham Young, it's much more cynical. It's a power move. And indeed, Joseph Smith is also interested in power over individual women. But in the case of Brigham Young, the idea is, I'll get people here, they will enter into polygamy, and then they can't leave. Because the point is, this is not a great place to be, right? This is the Great Basin. It's the Intermountain West. It's very arid. It's very, very dry. And what comes out of this is an economy in southern Utah, which is where the Romney family comes from, St. George, and which was this is where Romney's great-great-grandfather, Miles A. Romney and Miles P. Romney, helped build a summer palace, a winter palace for Brigham Young in this sort of southwest corner of Utah, right, pointing towards California. Down there,
all this talk of antinomianism, Webster, seems very strange to those of us who have known very nice, normal, ordinary Mormons who they won't even drink coffee because that coffee is haram or illegal in their religion. They seem very kind and down to earth, and they don't drink alcohol. They're not wild partiers. They're not polygamous at all. They're very, very monogamous. And so, how do you make that connection between this quality of the normal Mormons that one meets and their wild and crazy antinomian ancestors?
Well, again, any organization is going to display a tremendous dualism between the rank and file members on the one hand and the elite on the other. And on the elite side, I think it looks very, very different. Just a couple of things, right? Polygamy is alive and well in southern Utah. So there's a lot of polygamy in southern Utah, northern Arizona. There's a place called Hilldale, Utah, which shades over into Colorado City, Arizona, it's polygamous. And the mayor is a polygamist, the chief of police, the fire chief, the city council, the judges. Nobody but a polygamist has a chance in these places.
Well, you think the women would get elected to all the public offices since they would be outvoting the men by quite a wide margin.
That's the point. And this is a system of slavery of women. The background for this situation is it used to be when this was farming that the Mormon farmer became the overseer, and if he had 5 or 6 wives, the 5 or 6 wives were the field hands, and the man was then the overseer who would supervise the work but not have to do it. So it's an ugly system. You also have to think who is left out of polygamy? Young men, because a lot of young men will not find wives, and this is exactly what you see in this Hilldale, Utah, and northern Arizona. This guy Warren Jeffs, right? They put a name on it, right? Warren Jeffs is now in the federal pen and probably going to stay there for the rest of his life, unless Romney pardons him, right? But Warren Jeffs so far is in the pen, and his practice was to find any excuse you could to kick out young men, because those were a factor of instability, because they were not going to find wives. The other people who suffer, well, all women suffer, but especially the older ones, because the older ones can simply be kicked out, right? Brigham Young was a multimillionaire. He was fabulously wealthy. And he would, at a certain point, he would simply tell these wives, I'm not supporting you anymore. Get out. Go beg. Right? You're on your own. And they have no rights, right? Because the courts are all controlled by Mormon judges, right? The probate courts in particular was the way that Brigham Young ruled. But now, today, right? Orrin Hatch has been asked, what's with this polygamy that's flourishing in southern Utah? And Orrin Hatch, running for Senate, said, some of my best friends are polygamists. I think polygamists are very fine people. Oh, is that so? Let's take Mike Leavitt. Mike Leavitt is on his way right now to become the White House Chief of Staff, right? There's a good 50-50 chance of doing that. During the build-up to the 2002 Winter Olympics, Mike Leavitt was asked, the governor at that time, what do you think of polygamy? And he said, I think it may be covered by religious freedom. No. And again, religious freedom, the First Amendment, it pertains to worship, to churches, to church buildings, monasteries, whatever you want, to belief, to speech and writing. But when you pass into the area of overt acts, then the civil magistrate is the one who has the purview. And in particular, if you look deeper into Mormonism, right, beyond the polygamy, shocking and horrifying as that is, it is a relic of barbarism, right? That's what the Republican Party said in 1856, right? The 1856 Republican platform said, we're against two relics of barbarism, slavery and polygamy, and it meant the Confederates and the Mormons. But if you look deeper, the fact that Joseph Smith was not acclaimed dictator of the United States, right? That the American people did not bow down and worship Joseph Smith, but rather that a mob, tarred and feathered him, kicked him out of Missouri, and then ultimately in Illinois lynched him, right? Killed him with firearms. This is the grievance of the Mormons, and this I think you're going to find quite deeply. That and among some of those upstanding moral individuals, they have a narrative of persecution. They believe that the United States has treated them badly. Now,
and again, this kind of reminds us of the Jewish Zionist neocons, who also have a narrative of, we're the chosen people and we've been horribly persecuted throughout history, and here we're kind of, getting back at the world.
Well, and certainly on that side, Romney has reached out. Right? We know the likely Secretary of State is John Bolton, neocon. We've got Robert Joseph is the guy who wrote in the words about Saddam Hussein looking for yellow cake in Niger. He's on the team. The handler for Paul Ryan is Dan Senior, the spokesman for the provisional, the Coalition Provisional Authority of Iraq, the occupation. He was the spokesman for the indefensible. You've got Elliot Cohen, the kind of intellectual neocon from Johns Hopkins, was in the State Department also with Condi in the second term of Bush. Robert Kagan, right, from this Kagan family. His brother designed the surge in Iraq and also in Afghanistan. He's a military planner. So they're in there, right? They're going to control foreign policy. I'm surprised people say Americans don't vote on foreign policy. Well, you better, because among other things, because those neocons are going to come back, and they're coming back with their own grievance. They have a very right to say they have their traditional grievances. They have another grievance. They say, we got a bad deal under Bush. We were treated unfairly by the press. We were doing great. The American people didn't stay the course, right? The American people are no good. They didn't support us. We should have gone all the way in Iraq, all the way in Afghanistan, hundreds of thousands.
Should have gone into Iran. Don't forget Iran.
Yeah, and of course, so from their point of view, from the point of view of these neocons around Romney, they'd say, we want to vindicate ourselves. Well, how are they going to do that? Given who they are, these are one-trick ponies, as we've seen over quite a few years. They only know one thing. They'll say, our past wars of aggression are considered a failure. We'll vindicate ourselves now with new and successful wars of aggression. So there's all this.
Right.
But let me just
we didn't do it big enough last time. Let's blow up 10 skyscrapers and then go to war against Iran, a country 3 times as big.
Yeah, and if you want to see some scenarios for horrendous things, if you want to read about the destruction of Washington, Baltimore, Philadelphia, and New York, you can find this in the prophetic literature of the Mormons, because they are absolutely fascinated by the idea of New York being destroyed. And this is in my book. Right? I was shocked to see a genre that I had really not seen of people writing prophetically about the destruction of most of the United States and relishing it, right? Not that this was a horrible thing, but that this was God's justice. Now, this gets me back to Brigham Young.
That sounds worse than Osama bin Laden.
Again, remember that on 9/11, the one official we know was flying around in a national command center in a doomsday aircraft, was Brent Scowcroft, top Mormon, died in the War Mormon, Kissinger's right-hand man, and I think the gray eminence of the Mormon Mafia, the Mormon Mafia in the CIA and the Mormon Mafia in the FBI and the State Department. This is a powerful faction, and just an excursus on this, right? The way it comes about is... go ahead.
Yeah, go ahead. I was going to say, isn't there a prophecy about the Mormons somehow coming to seizing power and establishing a Mormon theocracy over the entire U.S.?
There is, and I'll mention that. Let me just since we started with the Mormon Mafia, where this comes from. You look at Mitt Romney. What did he do? He went abroad for 2 years, went to France, served as a missionary, comes back with some French. One of his kids, none of them ever joined the military. Right? They're all chicken hawks. They're all warmongers, but they ain't going.
Romney was a draft evader. I helped break that story where he was actually.
I'd like to see some sources.
But he wasn't allowed to be a missionary. There were no Mormon missionaries in France. It was illegal. He was just gallivanting around France, and apparently he never filled out any of the paperwork. So he was technically a criminal draft evader.
From the French point of view, I think he might have been illegal. But of course, we would need to see some backup on this, right? Not just who's the witness, who's the source, or what's the source? Where do we find it? But the Mormon Mafia, I think this is highly relevant because the Mormon Mafia is who carried out this Benghazi situation. Right? The fact that this ambassador died, he was assassinated by a CIA asset Kumu. He was not defended by a CIA rapid intervention group of 12 people that was there that didn't intervene. And the 17th of February Martyrs Brigade was there, and they're a CIA asset, and they didn't do anything for him either. So the CIA is involved in this in 3 or 4 ways. And I say that's the CIA Mormon Mafia. How do we get a CIA Mormon Mafia? They go overseas, they come back with a language, they don't join the military, at least a lot of them don't, and then they go into the CIA because they can say, I know a foreign language, I have foreign experience, and I don't smoke, I don't drink, I don't womanize, I'm a straight arrow, I live clean, and this is a great formula to get promoted. Plus you've got Brent Scowcroft and people like that making sure that the saints go up the ladder. Now let's go to the prophecies. There are probably 2 or 3 we should mention. The one that I was trying to get to first was the one from Brigham Young. This is about 1845, 1846. This is the oath of vengeance, and this is I think one of the most relevant for Romney. The oath of vengeance says, I swear to exact revenge from the United States and the American people for the murders of the prophets Joseph Smith, his brother Hiram Smith, and others. And I promise to teach this to my children down to the 4th generation. So it's a blood vendetta against the United States. Now, it's not wise to put somebody in as president who comes out of this tradition, and it's not a remote tradition at all. This was part of the liturgy. In other words, it's part of the Mormon Book of Common Prayer, the Mormon church service, right? What they call the Temple Endowment. Until about 1927 or 1928, every time you went to a Mormon temple, which is not the local church, but it's a somewhat higher level, right? There's one here in Washington, right outside the Beltway. It towers over the Beltway. You see it every time you go around the Beltway. The Temple Endowment had this until the late 1920s. Now, since it does contain this thing about teach it to your children and bind them down to the 4th generation. Well, George Romney, the father of Mitt Romney, was going to the Mormon temple in the late 1920s, right? He would have been, taking that oath repeatedly, and that means that he must have taught this to his son, Mitt, who has taught it to Tag, and to Tag's children, right? That would make 4 generations.
But wait a minute, isn't I thought George Romney was, by all accounts, a pretty honorable public servant. He was opposed to the Vietnam War. Had a pretty good reputation, a much better reputation than Mitt, who apparently made his money off laundering drug money, among other things. I'm sure you've heard about that. His 173% average annual return on investment had been kept for over a decade. But George Romney had a pretty good reputation.
I'm afraid not. Now, here's the thing. Here's the thing with George Romney. You have to know that during the 1930s, the Mormons were beyond soft on fascism. They were essentially pro-Hitler, and I have quite a bit of stuff about that in the book. That in 1933, the Mormon Pravda, right, the Deseret News, the house organ, official party organ of the Mormons, because it's a political faction. That's how I'm treating them. They say this thing about Hitler. Oh, Hitler's a great guy. He's a vegetarian. He doesn't smoke. He doesn't drink. The message is he's practically one of us, right? He's clean living. Goebbels doesn't drink, right? All this stuff.
Then guys would probably even take revenge on the USA too, wouldn't they? If they got the chance.
Well, I mean, it's speculation. What would the Nazis have done with the Mormons in case the Nazis had, gotten further? It's just speculation. You read the book. You'll get some ideas when you read it. A little bit later on, we have, a lot later on, in 1939. Okay, 1939 is very late in the day, right? We've had the Prague-Munich sellout, right? We've had the Kristallnacht, right? The Nazis attacking all the Jewish shops. At this point, the head of the Mormon Church in Germany, and they've been allowed to exist, writes an editorial or an article for the official Nazi party organ, Der Völkische Beobachter, the Nazi Party Daily, where he says it's called In the Land of the Mormons, and it's basically a puff piece about the Mormons and how the idea of das Volk, right, the people, and indeed die Rasse, right, race, the key Nazi concept, that these are somehow shared. The Nazi affinity for the Mormons is that the Mormons are completely white, right? You can't be a Mormon, you can't be confirmed really, or become a priest. When they say priesthood, that would be the equivalent of confirmed in Christianity. Something you do when you're about 12 or 14. Right? You can't get beyond that if you're black in the Mormon Church. So it's a lily white church, and it's highly lily white today. So the Nazis had a great affinity for that. It's a racially based church. That's what the Nazis saw. And this is practical. The only church...
that's interesting, isn't it, Webster, from that point of view, that Romney is such a walking caricature of all of the ugliest negative stereotypes about rich white guys, and he's running against the first black president, Obama. It's kind of an interesting, stark black and white contrast here.
Yeah, and he is that, right? He's not a wasp. He's a wasm. I'm sorry, no, I'm mixing it up and I'm getting the things wrong. But it is, but with this difference, right? Jim Crow and white supremacy is anchored in Mormon theology. It's anchored in the Book of Abraham, a later, fake revelation by Joseph Smith, which says if you come from the line of Ham, who has dark skin, then you can't be a priest. And think what that means. By the time you get to the middle of the 20th century, the only church that could guarantee you a lily white congregation was the Mormons. If you were a hardcore racist, you could say, why, these Baptists, they're not good enough, and these, Episcopalians, whatever they are. None of that is any good. Only the Mormons give me a guaranteed lily white congregation. Now, the Mormons are running away from that. We have Mia Love running for Congress out there in Utah. Right? She's trying to make up for it. But let me try to get back, just since you were asking about George Romney, and then we got to get back to the prophecies before we're done. With George Romney, right? He comes out of the fact that the Mormon Church is soft and even supportive of fascism and Nazism in the 1930s. Because they have this large interest there, right? They have this church going. The Protestants, the Lutherans, and the Reformed are allowed to continue. The Roman Catholics are allowed to continue, although that's where the friction is, right? The Pope Pius XI writes an encyclical condemning Nazi rule before he dies in the mid-30s. But then the Mormons, right? So those three, only those, Protestant, Catholic, Mormon, even though it's categorized as a foreign cult, they think it's useful or may be useful. Now, the Seventh-day Adventists, they go to the concentration camp. Anybody else, right? Any other church. And, of course, the Jews were indeed rounded up. So you can see when you read the Mormon accounts of this, they say, we haven't had any trouble. Some sects have been, given a hard time, but not us. So this is what George Romney comes out of. Now, George Romney, his problems with fascism are basically three things. He went to work for Alcoa, the Aluminum Corporation of America. Read it in the book, Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America from ProgressivePress.com. At a certain point, the Alcoa is in a cartel with German Nazi-controlled aluminum producers. And they refuse to produce aluminum for the U.S. war effort, for the British, for Lend-Lease, because they don't want to break their cartel deals with these German producers. So Harold Ickes, top New Dealer, Harold Ickes is quoted as saying, if the Nazis win the Second World War, they can thank Alcoa because they set back our production. We could have had 18,000 more planes or something like this, and they made sure that we didn't. So that's number one. He's the spokesman for that. Then he goes on to the Automobile Manufacturers Association. Who does he represent here? Henry Ford, Nazi, paid to, help finance Hitler coming to power. And at the same time, Alfred P. Sloan, they have Opel. Henry Ford has a plant in Germany. General Motors has a plant in Germany. The DuPonts, right? Irénée DuPont, who controls General Motors, is an outright Hitler lover. He's a Hitler admirer. So George Romney is the spokesperson for that. Now, when he ran for president, I haven't really studied his Michigan campaigns, but I did study his presidential campaign. His basic line is, all of our problems come down to a moral crisis. It's a moral crisis. It's what you hear from Ryan, right? The poor need discipline. They need a sense of purpose, right? It's their fault that they're poor, the idea being.
Is that 47%?
Yeah, that's Romney, certainly. And even Ryan shares the same thing. Ryan comes from a tentacle of the Mormons called the John Birch Society, which we could get into if we had time. But the thing then is, when Romney runs, he's running on what is called moral rearmament. This is called Buchmanism. Frank Buchman, B-U-C-H-M-A-N, launches this thing where he says, the issue is not fascism. As a matter of fact, I think Hitler is a great guy. But it's this moral crisis of the West, which is what? This is Franco in Spain, says the same thing, and Pétain, a little bit later in France, says exactly the same thing. Or, you've just heard it with Senator Santorum of Pennsylvania. But that was the line of George Romney. So George Romney, I think, emerges as a rather ugly person, hiding this stuff behind this pontificating. Also, you say Vietnam. He took one trip to Vietnam. He took two trips. The first trip he took to Vietnam was telling the GIs, you should die stoically for your country. Everybody's going to die. It's your time to die. Go and die. And the black GI says, okay, but Governor, can I get into your church before I die? And the answer is no, you can't. So this obviously this didn't sell well. So he changed himself around because he'd been pounded all his life because of the Mormons having this built-in racism, right? So he could have left the Mormon church. What is this, right? Romney is somebody who, the current Romney, stayed for 30 years in a racist, Jim Crow, white supremacist reactionary, right? Because people who want that are also outright reactionary. Anti-woman, anti-labor. The Mormon church is, the center of gravity is it's a right-wing reactionary bunch, right? And they do have some factions by now, right? They can't avoid that, but that's the center of gravity. Ezra Taft Benson was Eisenhower's Secretary of Agriculture all during the 50s. And this is the guy who said civil rights is communism, Martin Luther is a communist, Martin Luther King is a communist. And then when they were people were looking around for a racist candidate in 1968, before Wallace, this job was offered to Ezra Taft Benson, who would have taken it, but the Mormon hierarchy said, no, you're going out on a limb. And then when Wallace was named as the American Party candidate, they offered the vice presidency to Ezra Taft Benson of the Mormons, and he said no again. So that's what you're dealing with. Now, just quickly on the prophecies. The oath of vengeance was in the liturgy, the temple endowment, until the late 1920s, and it presumably binds Mitt Romney. I want to know about that. There's also an oath of obedience where Mitt Romney has sworn to obey in a way that I don't think any Catholic does, right? To obey the Pope. I don't know if this comes in. But in the case of the Mormons, it is that the guy sitting in Temple Square, Salt Lake City, is the prophet, the first president of the Mormon Church right now. It's a guy called Monson. Call him Monsoon. Maybe you'll remember it that way. He's got dementia, I think, but he's still infallible, right? He's a super pope. He's a prophet, right? Which not every pope obviously is, but if you're the head of the Mormon Church, you're a prophet. So that's another one. And then here's the third one, the White Horse Prophecy. This is Joseph Smith. It's 1843 to 1844, and he says, I'm going to tell you guys what's coming. A time is coming when the Constitution will hang by a thread. Mark those words. Hang by a thread. When the Constitution hangs by a thread, a powerful leader will emerge. The Mormons will take over the United States. The Mormons are the white horse. They're going to come out of the Rockies, take over the United States. They're going to ally the white horse, Mormonism, with the red horse, the British, and conquer the world. They're going to take over the entire world, and the last struggle will be against the Tsar of Russia, although they will have to deal with the heathen Chinese, as they write. The, quote, heathen Chinese, unquote, have to be kept out, and then on to the defeat of Russia. And at that point, God's law will encompass the earth. Because Mormonism...
That's kind of a scary thing for a potential president to believe.
Yes, and we can tie this to Romney through a number of articles where we have sort of biographical, reminiscences from people that knew him. When he was at Brigham Young University, in particular, after he came back from France, he was at BYU, named after this character, Brigham Young, right? Secessionist, hated Lincoln, seceded from the Union in 1857. But when Romney was at BYU, he is touted as the great white horse hope. He's touted as the guy, strong leader coming our way. He's the son of the top Mormon elected official in the United States. Romney is a descendant. He's a fifth generation Mormon. He goes back to this Parley P. Pratt, P-R-E-T-T. Parley Pratt is probably second only to Joseph Smith in his impact on the first 2 decades of Mormonism. He's a top theologian. He's a guy who comes up with the polytheism, because they have it, right? They're polytheistic, the polygamy, of course, and this theocracy, right? That self-government is blasphemy. It's got to be the dictatorship of God on earth. It's exactly what you hear from Al-Qaeda, except this is within the realm of Christianity. There's got to be a Christian worldwide empire.
I don't find that necessarily bad in itself. The problem is when the delegation of authority from God goes to these hierarchies made up of people, crazed, militaristic people with dementia, fascist types, and so on. But anybody who is purely dedicated to the only real ruler as God is going to be actually immune to some of the negative tendencies of human power seeking, don't you think?
Well, I'm on the Dante line, which is that you need 2 sons, right? One son shows you the way to God. One shows you the equally important way to order the earth, right? Western civilization is based on the idea that the Pope is one guy, the king or the emperor is another one, and they fight. And this is the opening of the Western mind: is that division of powers is what.
Well, I'm a Muslim. I don't want either Pope or king.
No, but I'm just saying in terms of call it a generic religious authority and a generic political authority. These are divided. Contrast this, say, to the Byzantine Empire. In the Byzantine Empire, the religious authority, the patriarch, is a dependance of the emperor, and the emperor is the political authority, semi-deified or deified all the way. I think in the Western world, at least, this is not the way. we're going to have this constitutional separation of church and state. Is just another way of saying the same thing: mosque and state, church and state, synagogue and state, whatever you want.
Right.
Now,
And I do support that in the USA. I think the Constitution here is a very valuable document, even if it is only hanging by a thread at this point.
Well, again, I would watch out for that hanging by a thread, because once you say hanging by a thread, this is what Romney is supposed to carry out. According to these biographical accounts, he has been touted his whole life as the guy who's going to implement the White Horse prophecy. Now, I invite people to think about that. Try to remember what it was like under Bush, right? When Bush was asked, "Did you ask your father, this other president, about going to war?" He said, "No, I consulted a higher father." That's already scary. But when the Mormons come forward and say the Constitution hangs by a thread, the White Horse and the Red Horse have to take over the world, and the final battle will be the Chinese first and the Russians second, then you hear Romney coming forward with this lunatic stuff that Russia is the main strategic foe of the United States. That's insane. And you're going to put that into the White House with Mike Leavitt and a crew of Mormons. Just before we leave Mike Leavitt, this is something that could become a scandal, I would hope, in the last weeks of the campaign. When Romney went out to Salt Lake City to save the Winter Olympics of 2002, his main purpose was to cover up. They had spent millions of dollars bribing the officials of the International Olympic Committee in the form of scholarships for their kids, their brother-in-law's kids, right? All this, corruption. In the middle of that was Mike Leavitt. He was the one that Romney saved. He prevented federal prosecution of Mike Leavitt, who was widely accused. The people who were indicted, the Mormons who were indicted, said, "We did everything with Mike Leavitt. Indict him too." And no. And finally, these two guys were let off by a judge who was also a Mormon. So much has not changed in Mormondom. The other thing about Mike Leavitt is that I told you already, he was asked if polygamy is legal, and he said, yeah, it may be religious freedom. Romney has written 2 books. One is called Turnaround, where it's the cover-up of the cover-up. It's trying to make the Salt Lake City Olympics into a great thing. That's Turnaround. And then he's got another one called No Apologies, which is that he'll never apologize. Right? Being a great man is that you never say you're sorry. Both of these say that when the Romney family fled the United States, they turned their back on the United States. They didn't give a damn about the U.S. They were going to Mexico. And the cause was polygamy. Very interesting thing, right? Choose between the patriotism, loyalty to the United States on the one side that they claim to have, polygamy on the other. At that point they say, Viva Mexico, let's go to Mexico and practice polygamy. And that's what they did. And they would have stayed there had it not been for Pancho Villa coming along with his army and chasing them out.
And what's interesting about this, Webster, is that George Romney's father apparently lost his citizenship for fleeing a felony charge to Mexico and then remaining there for X number of years. And George Romney was born in Mexico, and then when they moved back to the U.S., they never immigrated or repatriated or got their citizenship back, which meant that George Romney, as well as his father, were both illegal aliens.
Yes, and if George Romney had ever gotten close to the White House, right, having been born in Mexico from people, at the time that he was born in Mexico, the parents had no intention of returning. It's only Pancho Villa that drove them out. Just as an aside, the huge, Mexican Revolution of around World War I, not much studied in the United States, but
I was kind of like Pancho Villa, but if
yeah, sure, exactly.
Putting the Romneys back in the U.S., I'm not so sure if I like it anymore.
Well, he wanted to kick them out. All the Romneys can see, the whole immense Mexican Revolution, all they can see there is envy. In other words, the typical Mormon mentality is that they're indifferent to anybody's suffering but their own, right? They're in Nazi Germany. The Jews are getting it. The Seventh-day Adventists are getting whacked. All these other people are getting hit. They don't care about that because they say, oh, we were mistreated. Joseph Smith got a raw deal. And now in Mexico, right, tens of millions of people are being crushed by landowners and latifundists and reactionaries and God knows what. And all they can say is, Pancho Villa was full of envy. He wanted to steal our land that we had developed, and he thought that he could run it better, but then, of course, it it collapsed. So that
this sure sounds like the Zionist, doesn't it?
I think it sounds like a Mormon. In other words, I don't think the Zionists have any monopoly on evil at all, and there are other kinds of.
It's not just evil. I'm just saying that in both cases we have a group of people that has a narrative of we were horribly mistreated, and that makes them totally indifferent to the sufferings of others.
Besides, well, in terms of post World War II, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And that one, they say that one was invented by Meyer Lansky, who regarded this as, from his point of view, a benefit. He's saying, well, now that this has happened in Europe, right, and there was a large-scale massacre, call it what you will, and how many millions, I don't know, but then Meyer Lansky said, okay, after this I get to do whatever I want for the rest of my life. This is bad. But now we're dealing with the Mormon. In other words, some of these other things are better known. What I find is that the Mormons are not known. They're just not. And one of the failings of this campaign, imagine this. The United States is supposed to be, this big Christian country, right, with all these Christian fundamentalists and evangelicals and social conservatives. We are now at the point of electing a president who's not a Christian. And this does not seem to be worthy of notice, right? Nobody points it out. This is not.
Yeah, everybody's talking about Obama supposedly being a Muslim when he
exactly.
Isn't. And now we have a guy who's not a Christian. Right. It is pretty strange.
And it's not just that it's not a Christian, but this is a cult. This is a bitter, sectarian, tightly knit cult. It has come into existence after 1830. Just about every one of their main tenets of faith can be refuted, that it's historically a fraud. Joseph Smith himself was pronounced an imposter, guilty of disorderly conduct by the state of New York in the late 1820s. He was a con man, a mountebank, and so forth. Brigham Young, it seems to me, is a monstrous figure, seceding from the Union in 1857, murdering 130 travelers from Arkansas who were passing through. Later on, Brigham Young is waiting and hoping that the Union will lose the Civil War, and then he can secede and create a polygamous empire. And it's all the British East India Company. The basic idea is that the British want to build up a power against the United States in this Great Basin. So they move them out there, and they try to create the Empire of Deseret based on polygamy. And we mentioned John Stuart Mill defends them. Thomas Carlyle is the other big defender. Thomas Carlyle, in many ways, a precursor of European fascism of the 20th century. These are both employees of the British East India Company. John Stuart Mill is the sponsor of Carlyle's career. Carlyle, in turn, is one of the favorite authors of Hitler and the Nazis in general. His life.
Isn't that interesting how the masters of empire use sectarian conflict to divide and conquer, and that's just one example, and we're certainly seeing plenty of examples of that in the Middle East now.
Let me cite the way I got introduced to this was an Iranian living in Paris, Ali Mazaheri, at the École des Hautes Études Sociales, or something like this. And he said, Tarpley, the three miracles of the Victorian age are Joseph Smith and the Mormons, Karl Marx and the Communists, and the Bab and Baha'i. And he said all of these are sponsored by British intelligence in the broad sense. And I think that's all quite true. I would add two more. The Celestial Kingdom of the Taiping in China in these same years, 1830 to 1840. You get this guy called Hong. He's in touch with an American Baptist minister, but American with a difference. He's from South Carolina. He's a secessionist. He's a proto-Confederate. He comes from South Carolina to China, and at a certain point, his protege declares himself the younger brother of Jesus Christ. This starts a rebellion which kills between 20 and 30 million people. It's the biggest success that the British
So the moral of the story is watch out for British Empire-sponsored false prophets.
Watch out for them.
And Webster, I think we're going to have to...
Let me just to mention it, because I know you're interested. There's this guy, Sleeman, the British administrator of India, Sleeman, is the guy who creates modern Hinduism. In particular, he creates the cult of Thuggee, the thugs with widow burning and ritual assassination and strangling and all that. That's also a British creation. So the British are doing this across the world. And you can make an argument that Wahhabism and Salafism are actually created by the British India office and then shipped into Arabia out of India.
Yep, or at
I think
least
that's
partly
an interesting
sponsored, if
subject.
not completely created. Okay, well, Webster, thank you so much. It's been a great hour. I wish we could do it for 2 hours, but we would have had
If
to
I could
arrange
just
that in
just
advance.
reiterate then, it's called Just Too Weird, Bishop Romney and the Mormon Takeover of America, Polygamy, Theocracy, Subversion, ProgressivePress.com, ProgressivePress.com, Kevin's publisher, my publisher. Pay them a visit. You can get a copy, an ebook for as little as $6. Come on, $6. What's the problem with $6?
And if you read this, you will be ahead of the curve, just like I was ahead of the curve when Obama was elected. I already understood that Obama had unsavory associations, including, he's basically a made man of the CIA and the Brzezinski faction and so on. And none of my friends knew it. So you'll be months and months, if not years, ahead of the curve if you read Webster's books when they come out. Well, thank you, Webster Tarpley. It's always a pleasure. Keep up the great work.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.